In 1999, something happened in a small rural town called Briar's Crossing that completely shattered the idea that it was a safe place to live. Over the course of 4 months, 3 people were brutally murdered inside their own homes. What immediately confused investigators was that every house was locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry anywhere. But at each crime scene, there was one disturbing detail. An antique axe had been left behind, cleaned, wiped down, and placed deliberately near the body, almost like whoever did this wanted it to be found. As fear spread through the town, pressure mounted on police to make an arrest. People were afraid to sleep. Parents were walking their kids to school, and the longer the killer stayed free, the more panic set in. Then, just days after the 3rd murder, police announced they had their suspect. His name was Toby Harkins. Toby was a drifter who had recently passed through Briar's Crossing. He lived out of his car, picked up odd jobs, and didn't have any real ties to the town. Some people described him as strange. Others just said he didn't belong. When investigators looked at the murders, they described them as acts of uncontrollable rage, violent, emotional, and sloppy. The kind of crime they believed someone like Toby was capable of. Toby denied any involvement, but it didn't matter. The trial was short. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, and Toby Harkins was sentenced to life in prison. Initially, the problem with the case wasn't obvious. In fact, it went unnoticed for years, because it wasn't something you'd catch during a trial or a headline recap. You had to slow down and actually study the details, the kind of thing no one bothers to do once a conviction feels settled. Back in 1999, investigators had described the murders as frenzied and emotional, the result of someone completely losing control. That explanation made sense to people at the time. The crime scenes were violent, the weapon was brutal, and the suspect they arrested fit the image everyone already had in their minds. But when the wounds were re-examined decades later, that story started to unravel. The axe strikes weren't scattered across the bodies. They weren't uneven or erratic. Each blow landed in almost the exact same way, at nearly the same angle, with nearly the same amount of force. That kind of consistency doesn't happen when someone is panicking or acting on impulse. It happens when someone has done this before, or when they're very sure of what they're doing. And once that realization set in, it led to a much more uncomfortable question. If the physical evidence pointed to control instead of chaos, then why had these murders been officially labeled as crimes of rage from the very beginning? At first, the idea that the case might be wrong was treated more like a technicality than a serious concern. The conviction was decades old. The evidence had already been argued in court, and the town had long since moved on. Reopening it didn't feel necessary. The initial review wasn't even meant to challenge the verdict. It started as a routine look at archived materials, autopsy reports, trial transcripts, evidence logs, the kind of paperwork no one expects to change anything. But as inconsistencies started to pile up, it became harder to explain them away as simple mistakes or outdated methods. Some of the original evidence was missing. Other pieces had been documented in ways that were unusually vague, and certain conclusions appeared in the reports without clear explanations for how they had been reached. None of it proved that Toby Harkins was innocent on its own, but taken together it raised doubts that hadn't existed before. When those concerns were brought to the county, the response was muted. Officials acknowledged the discrepancies but emphasized the same point over and over again. The murders had stopped, a jury had reached a verdict, and there was no immediate reason to reopen old wounds. Behind the scenes, though, there was pushback. Requests for additional records were delayed. Access to physical evidence was restricted, and people who had worked on the case years earlier were suddenly difficult to reach. What made this resistance unsettling wasn't just that it existed, it was how coordinated it felt. The case wasn't being challenged publicly, but it also wasn't being allowed to move forward quietly. It sat in an uncomfortable middle ground, where questions were acknowledged but never fully answered. As time passed, one thing became increasingly clear. If the original conviction was wrong, correcting it would mean admitting that the system itself had failed, not just once, but at every stage, from investigation to trial to oversight. And that was something Briar's Crossing wasn't ready to face. Not yet. What finally forced people to stop brushing off the inconsistencies wasn't the language in the reports or the missing paperwork. It was a date. During the review, someone noticed that one of the autopsy reports, the one from the second murder, had been quietly amended 3 days after Toby Harkins was arrested. And then came the detail that made it impossible to explain away. Based on lividity patterns and body temperature, at least one victim had likely been killed hours earlier than the official time of death stated in the report. That earlier window placed the murder before Toby Harkins was even confirmed to be in town. That information never made it to the jury. Instead, the official timeline was adjusted, just enough to keep Toby in the frame. At that point, the question wasn't whether mistakes had been made, it was how many. Because whatever voice had been shaping this case from the start hadn't just influenced opinions. They had revised facts after the arrest in a way no one thought to question at the time. And suddenly, the idea that this was all just a tragic error didn't hold up anymore. Once it became clear that the autopsy reports had been altered after the arrest, investigators were forced to confront a reality they hadn't wanted to touch. There was only one role in the entire system with the authority to do that. Detectives couldn't rewrite medical findings, prosecutors couldn't adjust causes of death, and judges couldn't change timelines. Only one person could legally revise an autopsy report after it had already been completed and have that revision accepted as fact: the county coroner. That realization changed everything because the coroner wasn't just documenting injuries. They were deciding what those injuries meant. They were setting the official timeline. They were defining whether the violence looked impulsive or controlled, whether it suggested rage or precision. And once those determinations were written down, everyone else treated them as unquestionable. The coroner was present at every scene, had direct access to the bodies. He handled the earliest and most critical evidence. And unlike detectives, the coroner didn't need a warrant to be there. They weren't considered part of the adversarial process, which meant no one was watching them closely. So when autopsy reports were amended days after an arrest, when timelines shifted just enough to keep a suspect in rang, and when language across different cases started to look copy-pasted instead of independently observed, it all pointed back to the same place. By the time the trial began, the version of events the jury heard had already been shaped, refined, and locked into place. And the person with the most influence over that story was someone no one had ever considered capable of doing harm at all. His name was Marcus Tate. Marcus Tate wasn't just some distant official who signed paperwork and disappeared. He had been a fixture in Briar's Crossing for nearly 2 decades. He lived less than 10 minutes from all 3 victims. He attended town meetings, and he volunteered at local events. People knew his face. More importantly, people trusted him. He was calm and soft-spoken, the kind of person who never raised his voice and never seemed rattled, even when standing over scenes most people couldn't stomach. Families remembered him as reassuring, the man who explained what would happen next when everything felt out of control. which is why no one questioned how much time he spent alone with the bodies. According to scene logs, Marcus Tate routinely arrived early and stayed late. In at least 2 cases, he was alone with the victim for over an hour before investigators returned to the room. That wasn't illegal. It wasn't even unusual. But here's what stopped people cold. When Marcus Tate's personal notes were finally uncovered, notes that had never been submitted as evidence, they showed that he had initially documented the wounds accurately, controlled, deliberate, repeated. Those notes were later rewritten, and the rewritten versions were the ones entered into the official record. The shift happened after Toby Harkins became a suspect. Then came the detail no one could explain away. Investigators discovered that Marcus Tate owned an antique axe collection, including a model that matched the murder weapon down to the head shape and handle length. One axe in particular showed signs of repeated sharpening, not the kind of wear you'd expect from display alone. And there was one final detail that turned suspicion into horror. In the weeks following Toby's arrest, Marcus Tate abruptly filed for early retirement. Within days of the conviction, he sold his house, and before anyone thought to question him formally, he vanished. By the time the case review identified him as the common thread running through every altered report, every shifted timeline, and every misleading conclusion, Marcus Tate was already out of reach, and Toby Harkins was still sitting in a prison cell. And the man who had quietly shaped the entire narrative of the case from the moment the bodies were discovered had never spent a single night being questioned. Now, what finally forced Briar's Crossing back into the spotlight, along with the initial review that faced pushback, happened nearly 400 miles away. In 2024, investigators in a neighboring state were reviewing an unsolved homicide involving a married couple found dead in their home. Like the Briar's Crossing murders, there was no sign of forced entry. Doors were locked, and windows were intact. And near the bodies, investigators found an antique axe, cleaned, wiped down, and left behind. At first, the similarities felt unsettling but coincidental. Axe murders are rare, but not unheard of. What made this case different was the forensic detail. The wounds showed the same kind of precision. Consistent angles, controlled force, no hesitation. One of the investigators working the case had previously studied historical unsolved crimes. When they saw the photos, they thought of Briar's Crossing immediately. They pulled the files, and when they laid the cases side by side, the similarities went far beyond the weapon. The language used to describe the wounds was nearly identical. The estimated times of death followed the same narrow window. Even the way the axe was positioned at the scene matched. That's when a question surfaced that no one in Briar's Crossing had ever seriously asked. Who had been involved in all of those cases, without ever being a suspect? The answer led straight back to one name: Marcus Tate. Marcus Tate didn't see himself as a killer. According to people who knew him, he believed he was correcting things. Years before the first murder, Marcus had quietly complained to colleagues about what he saw as the town's moral decay. He kept lists of people he believed were liars, adulterers, abusers, or threats to the community's image. What connected the victims in Briar's Crossing wasn't chance, it was judgment. Each victim had been the subject of rumors Marcus had heard through his work, church contacts or town gossip, affairs, abuse allegations that were never proven, behavior that offended his sense of order. The axe wasn't random either. It was ceremonial. Marcus believed the weapon symbolized finality, a clean end, delivered decisively. That's why it was always wiped down and left behind. He wasn't hiding what he'd done. And Toby Harkins? Toby wasn't framed because Marcus hated him. He was framed because Marcus needed someone the town would accept. Toby was transient, poor, isolated, easy to believe capable of rage. Once Toby became a suspect, Marcus adjusted his reports just enough to lock the narrative in place. And then he stopped, because in Marcus's mind the problem had been solved. The out-of-state murders suggest he didn't stop forever, just long enough to disappear, relocate, and start again where no one knew his name. By the time investigators connected the cases, Marcus Tate had already slipped out of reach. What made the truth about Toby Harkins so hard to accept was how thin the case against him had always been. When independent investigators finally gained access to the original evidence decades later, one detail jumped out immediately. There was no DNA tying Toby to any of the crime scenes. None. No blood transfer, no skin cells on the axe, no fibers from his clothes, no fingerprints, not even partials, on the weapon that had supposedly been handled repeatedly. In fact, the axe itself had been wiped so thoroughly that investigators now believe the killer wore gloves the entire time, a level of foresight that directly contradicted the prosecution's original claim that the murders were acts of blind, emotional rage. Then came the motive, or rather the lack of one. Toby had no relationship with any of the victims, no shared history, no financial ties, no recorded disputes. He hadn't even been in town during one of the estimated windows of death, a fact that had been quietly dismissed at trial as a clerical error. That error wasn't a mistake. It was buried alongside witness statements that placed Toby miles away from one crime scene, buried alongside an early forensic memo questioning whether the wounds were inflicted by someone trained in anatomy, buried alongside internal emails that warned the case would collapse without circumstantial padding. And then there was Marcus Tate. Financial records uncovered years later showed a pattern no one could explain away. Marcus had made several unusually large cash deposits in the months leading up to Toby's trial. Around the same time, 2 prosecutors involved in the case paid off personal debts in cash. Investigators now believe Marcus bought the case. He ensured certain evidence was never logged, that lab requests were lost, that expert testimony questioning the prosecution's theory never made it into the courtroom. By the time Toby stood before the jury, the story had already been written for him. A drifter, an outsider, someone easy to fear. Toby was convicted not because he was guilty, but because he was convenient. Years later, when the out-of-state axe murders forced a full review of Briar's Crossing, everything unraveled at once. The hidden documents surfaced, the forensic contradictions became impossible to explain, and the absence of any real evidence against Toby finally came into focus. His conviction was overturned. After more than 2 decades behind bars, Toby Harkins walked free. No apology from the state, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just a quiet release, as if the system hoped no one would notice. But by then the damage had already been done. Toby had lost his youth, his family, his name. And somewhere, a man who never stood trial slept peacefully, his past sealed by favors, money, and silence. Justice was never denied to Toby. It was simply given to someone else, because after a repeat of the same crimes, he vanished yet again. If you're still here, you're one of the curious ones. Stick around. The next mystery's already waiting.